In certain countries, military establishment being the most powerful political force has evolved from using the brute violence to covertly using its well-funded and well-organized propaganda apparatus to manufacture political consent. At the same time, the sword of libel, slander, and the constitutional bars hang over the heads of the journalists, which restricts them to quite an extent. And in such a kind of a propaganda model, which is covertly carried out, it is very difficult to get hold of empirical evidence. In such a scenario, what should the journalists like me do? How they can carry out their moral and professional duties?
It's never easy. There are power systems everywhere. Journalists in the West face somewhat analogous problems, nowhere near as severe, but the shaping and control of editorial policy and what you can talk about, what you can't talk about, they do put constraints and bounds on journalists who seek the best ones who understand it, try to find ways around them in various ways. Of course, that's nothing like the problems that journalists face in Pakistan or Turkey or other repressive countries where they can simply be murdered or imprisoned or something. So not the case in the West. You can lose your job, but nothing else. So how do you confront it? And no outsider can give any advice. You simply, the best way to confront it is to try to build up popular support, which can open a certain range of partial freedom. But it's a hard struggle. And within it, you're always pressing the limits and trying not to be, say, assassinated or imprisoned.
Uphill battle. Going on from there, you said that students can play a crucial role in bringing out a change. But after the internet revolution, the youth of today have entered into the era of social media platforms. They are increasingly divorced from the reality and living in online social bubbles, which consist of homogeneous, closed social groups. Moreover, the flow of information on these social platforms are being controlled by computer algorithms. Multinationals use these algorithms to promote consumptions of products that they want to sell to the consumer, and consumer actually don't need. Similarly, the political elite, the global political elite, are using these algorithms to manufacture political consent or control their opinion, in other words. Youth, on the other hand, however, is increasingly being addicted to these platforms, which makes them easy target to psychological manipulation. So, how do you expect from such a generation who is addicted to being to these social media platforms to think critically and bring change in the society?
Well, I'm old enough to think of earlier periods when there were no social media, no internet, and the youth were totally apathetic and not attending to huge political issues. Let me just give you the striking example. The worst crime since the Second World War, and by a large margin, is the U.S. invasion of Vietnam and all of Indochina. Devastating, horrifying, devastating crime. Started in the early 50s, really took off with John F. Kennedy when he escalated the war in 61 and 62. I was one of the very few people who was active in protest against it. I was literally giving talks in somebody's living room or a church with half a dozen people. Our first efforts to, I'm talking about Boston, one of the most liberal cities in the country. 1965 was the first attempt to have a public demonstration. Mild, I was supposed to be one of the speakers. no speaker could be heard. A demonstration was attacked pretty violently, mostly by young people. Bloodshed was prevented by hundreds of state police. The liberal press, the most liberal newspaper in the country, bitterly denounced the protesters. It wasn't until 1967, by which time South Vietnam had been virtually destroyed, before substantial protests developed. No social media, no internet, just deep indoctrination. Okay? I think it's much better now. In fact, take the 2016 election. The most spectacular result of the 2016 election was not the election of a billionaire with huge corporate support and huge media support. That's a little bit off the norm, but not that much. The real achievement, which of course isn't discussed, is the Sanders campaign, which broke with all of modern American history. It's the first time that a candidate was able to practically win a nomination without any media support, no corporate support, no support from wealth. Totally different from all of American political history. Now the most popular political figure in the country, with very effective organizing going on, of young people who are not blocked by social media and the internet. So look over the course of history. Lots of things that are wrong, but a lot of progress too. So yes, you can break these bounds. Social media are a problem, but it's nothing like a military regime which murders you and puts you in jail. That's much worse. I don't have to tell you in Pakistan. So yes, there are plenty of opportunities to break out, and plenty of people are breaking out of it.
Ontologically speaking, greed is an innate characteristic of human nature. Greed provides the impetus for capitalism. Historically, capitalism has always almost prevailed over the counter ideologies. Therefore, don't you think any effort to resist capitalism is a futile exercise? Secondly, don't you think planting ideas of resisting capitalism in the mind of youth will lead to shattered dreams and regrets of not hopping on the capitalist bandwagon, resultantly, as a consequence, ending up at the lower end of the financial ladder?
Well, that's an interesting illustration of the power of Western doctrine. Capitalism is a very recent phenomenon in human history. Even Adam Smith was basically pre-capitalist in mentality. So if you read Adam Smith, supposedly the icon of capitalism, he bitterly condemned those he called the masters of mankind, the British manufacturers and merchants, because they were pursuing their vile maxim, everything for ourselves and nothing for anyone else. He bitterly condemned the savage injustice of the Europeans in destroying India. He warned that if you see two businessmen in a corner talking, they're probably engaged in a conspiracy against the public. In certain ways, he was in favor of the free market, but he said regulations are always in order if they protect the working man. He's famous for admiring division of labor, less famous for bitterly condemning it, because it turns people into creatures as stupid and ignorant as a human can possibly be. So in any civilized society, the government will have to intervene to prevent it. This is Adam Smith. He did talk about the invisible hand, but take a look how. So he argued that suppose that it's an agricultural society. He said, suppose some landowner gets almost all the land and everybody else is destitute. He said it won't matter that much, but because the landowner will have sympathy for the needs of others, he'll make sure that they have a fair share of all the wealth that he owns, so as if by an invisible hand, inequality will be overcome. Is that capitalism? I mean, this is Adam Smith. Capitalism is a recent innovation imposed with substantial force, beginning with the enclosure movements in England, moving on, resisted every bit of the way. Late 19th century in the United States, when industrialization was beginning, there was a very lively working class press then, bitterly condemning the industrial system, which was taking away people's basic rights. Wage labor was regarded as comparable to slavery, different only in that it was supposedly temporary. It was not an exotic position. That was a position of Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party. That's late 19th century. Finally, capitalism was imposed, and its doctrines became kind of common sense. But as the result of major force, very recently, and there's plenty of opposition to it, it shows up in all kind of ways. Maybe not by people writing articles against capitalism, but by resisting it all over the place, resisting it on the shop floor, the discipline and managerial impositions, resisting in the electoral systems. And take a look at European elections. The most striking feature of them is that the centrist parties are being destroyed. Election after election, people just want something else. They may not call it anti-capitalism, but they're resisting the results of the more savage form of capitalism that was instituted under.
Ultra-right is progressing there. Europe, right is on the rise, so they're pro-capitalists.
And so is the opposition to it. So Corbyn in England is not the ultra-right. Take, say, Germany, where the AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, did much better than expected in the last election. There are some reasons for that, which don't get publicized in the press. You can read about them in the business press, which tends to be more honest. What happened in the German election? There's a media corporation in Texas which works for Trump, Marine Le Pen, Benjamin Netanyahu, others like them. They got together with the Facebook office in Berlin and commissioned Facebook to give them detailed analysis of German voters. Facebook has tons of information about individuals. So the Facebook worked out detailed information for them. They used it for micro-targeting ads in favor of AfD, in favor of the neo-fascist party, to Germans, targeted to their particular vulnerabilities and so on. Now, nobody's investigated just what the impact of that was. That's one of the things that journalists don't look at, but you could. And it was probably had a substantial effect. That's part of the rise of the far right, but it's not the main reason. The main reason for the far right is capitalism in its savage neoliberal form. Under Europe, it's called austerity. But that means that the German banks, through Brussels, are setting policy which people don't participate in. Decisions are out of their hands. It leads to stagnation, enormous youth unemployment, precarious occupations. People are angry, rebellious. It often takes antisocial forms, including what you mentioned. But just take a look at the sources. The sources are modern capitalism, and people are resisting it, sometimes in positive ways, sometimes in negative ways. So yes, it's regarded as common sense by doctrinal determination, which is not anybody's plot. It's just become ingrained as elite common sense. But recently, against constant resistance and imposed by great force and very fragile, I think it can fall apart at any time.